have any questions about yesterday's? So I didn't post the poll, but since it was the first lecture, I figured there might not be questions, but if there are any questions about yesterday's workshop, then please feel free to ask. You can drop it in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask about going over any of the problems from yesterday's workshop, and then I can go over them if you guys would like. But going forward, it's basically going to be an actual poll where I'll put each question of the workshop in, and you guys can just select whatever question you guys want to be reviewed. See someone's raising. Yeah, Ryan, feel free to ask a question.
Yeah, so I just wanted to know if you had a chance, like you just said, look over those 3 problem sets yesterday, and if we were supposed to move around the code rather than just put the like brackets and code lines on your lines.
Yeah.
Was there supposed to be any code movement around other than those 2?
Sorry, let me close my window. There's some noise, but I kind of. Do you want me to just go over? Do you want me to just go over all the problems you said? Should I just review them?
Please go over all of the problems.
Yeah, cool. Let me get to the assignments. So yesterday's was introduction and tidy code, the workshops. I'll just show you guys, share my screen. Can you guys see?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So let's go over the first problem. I think these are already all cached, so let me try and go using a different browser so that it's not saved. Kind of want to just work through it from scratch. Let's see. Damn, I guess it's my account maybe that it's saving it up. Why am I even? It's so weird. Let me try Firefox. I don't know why it's saving all my stuff even though I'm not logged in or anything, so. Weird. How do I reset this? Yeah, I'm not sure how it's saving everything. One sec. Yeah, how the heck do I? Yeah, I'm like so confused. I'm not logged in, but it's like saving all my. Let me try to see if I have this one too. Sorry guys, give me 1 sec while I try to figure this out. Like using a separate browser. Still saving it. This is a specific pen. Can anyone send me their link by any chance? In the chat or something? Like the link for the... actually, let me...
Could I send you just the code that I have somehow?
Yeah, but then... I just want to start... I don't know what it looks like when you guys see it, you know? Because this is like my own version. 1 sec. Let me try to go to a different cohort and see if it's the same link. Yeah, it's so weird. Oh, do you guys already have it like that? Is this how it looks for you guys too?
Yeah, that's the starting.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm like running around in circles. Okay. Cool. So if this is how it looks for you guys and you guys can all see it, I'll go ahead and get started right now. In terms of like what I would do for styling, and again, styling is there's different rules. When people work on the same code base, they establish a set of rules. Like we're gonna use tab-based spacing. We're gonna use regular two-space-based formatting. We're gonna use colons or semicolons. We're not going to use semicolons. They establish all these rules in this configuration file, and then the code will just sort of you can like auto format stuff, but definitely there are times where either that's not set up or you just have to code in an interview where you don't have that robust environment, and so you'll have to get used to spacing code and figuring out how to make it readable. So basically it will get somewhat intuitive, but right off the bat, whenever there's a squiggly bracket, I would just like whatever comes after it, I would like space it in 2 spaces as a standard. And then there's no squiggly bracket here, so this should be in the same line as this one too, because this has there's no squiggly bracket. But whenever you see a squiggly bracket, you should whatever's inside of it, because now this line 5 is inside this function, so you kind of wanted to make it clear that it is, rather than leaving it like at this level where we might just think it's the same level of all of these expressions. So I would move this in 2 spaces, and then there's no squiggly bracket here either, so do the same for whatever comes after it. Whatever comes after it should all be on the same line if there's no squiggly. And now there is a squiggly, so 7 would go 2 in. And we kind of just follow that logic throughout. And then here we can see that this while loop ends, like this squiggly bracket corresponds to this while loop. So I would try to put this squiggly bracket line it up with the while, because for example, every squiggly should also line up, because you see how this one's already lined up, 2 and 14, because this, if you click on it, it'll tell you what the corresponding closing tag is. And so the closing tag should be at the same indentation as whatever the first character is that starts that expression. So here is, if you can see an example, 8 and 10, line 8, the if, is in the same indentation as the closing squiggly bracket. So that should always be the case. Here, while it wasn't, it was like this or something, but we want to move it so it lines up with the while. So so we know that the closing bracket is perfectly aligned with the first character of whatever starts, the first character of a line where the opening bracket starts. And so, you know, we look it up to here. This part's kind of confusing. We usually, every time there's a closing bracket, we don't really want anything to come after that. We want it to be empty space. So this one's a little confusing, but for now, we want to follow that rule where after a closing bracket, we don't want any other code on that same line. So we just like want to move this down, and we'll figure out what to do with that later. But for now, we'll just put it on a new line. And basically, we want to see where these closing brackets are. So let me move this down a little bit. So this is lined up with this. Now this closing bracket is not lined up. It's like all messed up. So I kind of want to, well, first let's move this down because we don't want anything after a squiggly bracket, right? So let's move that down. And then this one and this one are like not aligned. Does anyone want to tell me what line they think they should be on, this closing bracket?
It'd be on line 14.
Yeah, perfect. Because we can't really move it anywhere that we want it to be in the same line, because again, the opening bracket should, and the first character of the opening bracket should be perfectly indented with the closing bracket. So like this. Now we're good. Like it lines up perfectly. But the only issue is now this return, which should be inside the function, now looks a little weird. So we should put this one in too, because the return is returning us a result from the function. So it's inside of the function. So it should be 2 spaces in. Like we wouldn't want it to be like this, because this return, similar to this expression variable declaration, is inside the function. So this should also be inside the function. So is this. They're all at least one level indented, and the only stuff that's further indented are inside squiggly brackets of their own, like they're inside their own block.
Is the inner beauty function inside the style me pretty? So is the style me pretty the main function of this page?
Yeah, exactly.
So how would we know, what gives that away that we would supposed to know that?
Because of the squiggly bracket. So this closing one encloses everything, right? Which means that, and I'm gonna move this one, which means that this one has to be inside of this one. So the outermost function is our main function, because if we look at the squiggly bracket and where it ends, this whole thing is contained within this function. So when we actually call this function, which is like outside, when we actually say like, oh, style me pretty, we don't really even have access to this inner function. Like we can't access it unless we're inside of the style me pretty function. And then here we can do something like call inner beauty within it. But when we're outside of it, we can't even access this inner function. But to your question of how do we know which one's like the main one and which one is the one that's enclosing it, the brackets will give that away, because as you can see, this opening and closing bracket, the entire contents of this function are contained within those opening and closing brackets, which means that's the inner function that's inside of the outer one.
Okay, good, thanks.
And so just to quickly review, we see this opening bracket. So everything that's inside of that opening bracket should at least be indented 2 spaces in. That's why, you know, if this was here, we push it in here. And then the same thing here. Oh, there's no opening bracket. So everything else, if it doesn't have an opening bracket, it'll stay indented in the same line, or in the same y-axis. But then, as you can see here, there's another opening bracket. So whatever's inside of here, I should indent 2 spaces in. So if this was here, indent this 2 spaces in. If this was here, indent 2 spaces in. And same thing. It's just the same repeating pattern, regardless of whether it's a function that's creating the block, or regardless of whether it's a conditional statement. If, while, it doesn't matter. Everything 2 spaces in until you hit another one, and then it's 2 spaces in again. Now, you know, this statement right here is technically outside of this enclosing block, but it's still within this enclosing block, right? It's still within the function, but it's just not in the while loop. So then if this was here, we still want it to be lined up with everything else because there's no enclosing block. So it should be at the same level as other expressions that also don't have an enclosing block, other than this functional enclosing block. And then same thing here, and then return, like always returns, everything within a function should at least be 2 spaces in, regardless of whether it's a function, regardless of whether it's a variable declaration, another function declaration, a expression that just, is a computation, or this one's messed up, but this one should be on the new line too. Or a return, it doesn't matter. They should all be indented 1 in if they're within a block. And there should be nothing after a closing bracket. Like there should be no, and like also here too, there should be nothing like this. Like they should all be on a new line. Everything after a closing bracket should be on a new line. And they should never be on the same line as a bracket. So if you make the function look like this, then it is a little more understandable, where we see, oh, the first thing that happens is we declare a variable to be a string, an empty string, and then we declare a function that's defined within the scope of this outer function. And then we do a bunch of, more variable declarations, some iterations, return values from this inner function, and then we add, we call that inner function. Within the outer function, we call the inner function, and then we return a value at the end. So yeah, definitely good to keep these things in mind, because although in most working environments there'll be like some automated process that like kind of like handles all this for you, like there's still going to be times where you're gonna have to code in these interview settings, or even though you can rely on those automated formatters, like it won't format. Like there'll be times where you'll have to do a little bit of the work, and then it'll get you like 100% of the way there, but you kind of have to have intuition for getting yourself at least like 80% there, or else like you might confuse the linter if it's like too messed up. Are there any questions about this first problem?
I noticed that like when because I was using VS Code.
Yeah.
And because the spec.js file is different from the just the JS file, so it would only take in. Would it just be better just to stick with CodePen instead, because we can see whether it's passing the test or not?
Yeah, I would say you can mess with VS Code, but I wouldn't like get too bogged down in like all the configurations, and like if something's weird is happening, then I wouldn't waste too much time on that, because the more important thing is to get these foundational concepts down, and those are more like configuration related, or VS Code is a very important tool to get good at when you're actually building applications, but I would say that's not a priority. But yeah, still good to practice it, because eventually there'll be a time where it'll become like your left arm or your right arm. It'll become just something that you're always working in. Any other questions?
This is not for this specific question, but I've seen sometimes after the closing curly bracket, people put the else statement there. Is there a best practice as far as shouldn't else be on the same line after a curly bracket, or if it should be on its own new line?
I think this is the convention. Oh, actually, you're right. There is a time. So in an else statement, because I remember I said don't put anything after a closing bracket, but else is a exception. So this is like the conventional way to format an if else, is basically to have it look like this. So that does break the rule. I mean, I guess there's always an exception.
That'd be the same for if else also?
Oh, this is an if else.
Oh, right.
Yeah. So
I
good
think we
point.
need else if, but yes.
Or else if, yeah.
Oh, yeah. I think so. Else.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, like this. So yeah, great point. Definitely keeping me on my toes. There's definitely exceptions to the rule, and in this particular case for else's, you would put that on the same line. Same here. If there's another else if, then you would do this. So yeah, good point. Any other questions? If not, let's go over the next one. Justin Camel case. Yeah, I guess these are all just passing tests, and we just got to camel case these. So yeah, pretty much the same thing. We'll move this back, and then we'll capitalize each word. I mean, it's a little easier to read too, I guess. When there's sometimes where you know there might be ambiguous which word, when the one word ends and another begins. This kind of helps with that visually, and it's just an established convention to use camel case for most things. You know, I would say 80%, 90% of most of variables you'll write are going to be camel case, but there are certain exceptions, like when you create constructor functions. Sometimes people like to use capital, like stuff like that, for if a function is outputting a object or creating an object. But those are all not important for now. So I would just camel case everything. If you're unsure, just camel case. Yeah, I'm not gonna do all of them, but you guys get the point. And again, there's more spacing issues here. So again, opening bracket, and then this one's within this else. Where does this else end? Yeah, it's within this entire else scope right here. So they should all be lined up too. And then this one is within this inner else. So these should also go in here, because this one and this one also should be lined up vertically with whatever starts this the opening bracket. Go to the first character of where it starts, and then line up the end, the closing bracket with that first character. This one also should be in, and yeah, let's see. If else, this else. So in regards to if else statements, like the closing bracket of the else should be lined up with the if, the first if. And then see how like this else, the closing bracket, lines up with the if that it's corresponding to, and this else closing bracket lines up with the if that it's corresponding to. So the else's should always line up with the if that it's corresponding to, the closing bracket. And then yeah, this is a for loop. It's all messed up. And I also tend to just put spaces right here, just so it's a little more less like cluttered. And so here there's a for loop, right? So then I would suggest that I would say that this for loop closing bracket should be aligned with this for loop. So I'd move these all in, and I may be messing something up here, but yeah, we have this for loop that corresponds with that. Yeah, this is kind of weird. Let me see. This
The if needs to move in. On line 9.
This one? Yeah. I think this is.
Sorry, line 6 is what I meant.
Oh yeah, you're right. So this thing needs to move in. And yeah. Cool, because this for loop closes, and It's always a good sign when like it makes sense. Kind of like the closing brackets are evenly spaced. It's usually a good sign. Like looking like a staircase. And yeah, we'll move that one. This one is yeah. This one should probably be 2 more spaces like that. I think we're good. I think, wait. The 4 should not be moved in, so like that. Okay. I didn't camel case everything, but that one's a little more straightforward, I feel like, than the spacing. Spacing can get a little tricky. But again, some basic tips are wherever you see the opening bracket, go to the first character, and the closing bracket should be lined up with that. In an if-else, the else can come after the closing bracket, and the closing bracket of the else should be matched up with the if of whatever it's corresponding to. So like here you see this closing bracket of the else corresponds to the if that it's corresponding to. And yeah, pretty much it. Any questions about this problem?
Yeah, one question. The return expression. I've always seen that happen before, but is there a specific reason why it's not a part of the, not saying part, but like why it's placed there as opposed to underneath camel case output plus equals underneath expression?
Oh, like why isn't it here?
Yeah, like instead of being underneath that, it's placed here. Is there a special reason why that is?
Yep, because this variable is being acted upon in the loop. So we can't return within the loop because then it won't finish the loop. It'll like on the first iteration, it'll just break the loop and return you an intermediate value that hasn't been fully worked on yet, because if whatever this length is, that's how many times they want this loop to run, and that's how many times they want this variable to be redefined or modified. But if you return within the loop, then you're like short-circuiting it.
Oh, okay. I understand.
Yeah, so you
all right.
No, that's good. That's a great question.
Thank you.
Yeah, so if you wanted to break the loop early, then you could return. So you could say something like, oh, you know, like if like my condition is met, then you could just return early. Like you can return the thing like within the for loop, because like if you're checking something within each loop and the condition is met and then you want to return and you want to break the loop early, then that's fine. You can go ahead and do that.
Okay.
But in most cases, like there's a specific reason why you say to run X amount of times, and so this variable will be acted upon X amount of times, and then we'll finally give the output after. Sorry about the scrolling, but that'll happen after, like right after the loop is done running. That's when we have the variable of interest.
Okay. Thank you.
Which is constantly modified in line 13. All right. Any other great questions, by the way, guys? Just keep them coming. So get maxed. Final one right here. Oh crap. Yeah. So this is some more of the same. So I don't like how this is all on the same line. So I'm gonna start putting things on new lines. Everything after the squiggly bracket, I'm gonna put them on, because there's no, unless there's an else, in which case I could see the point of maybe keeping it, but for now I'd want to move these, and like so here, like we can keep this here, but this isn't an else, so new line, also new line, and this is an else, so I can keep that here, and then here I want a new line. And you never want stuff like this, like stuff that's like right after each other, because you don't know what that corresponds to, or it's harder to tell. So you want, for the most part, things on the new line. And I mean, in general, this is like somewhat decent. Move this. So this is at this level. No, it's within it. Yeah, they were good. I would just like move these here. But for the most part, this looks good. Yep.
Wouldn't the returns be indented there after else if and else?
This?
Yeah.
So it is because you mean like, so because it's within this bracket, you still want to, like if it was here, you'd want to put it into, or you mean like indent it even further?
Yeah.
I can see why you say that, because it looks like it's in the same it looks like in the same axis, like y-axis as the else, but I believe this is fine because of the fact that the else is kind of weird. It's not like a normal expression in that like it starts at the same line as the end closing bracket. So because you know, it's easy to tell that this return is within this else because it's enclosed in these brackets. I don't think you need to go an extra level further.
Okay.
Yeah, it's fine to keep it. Else is like the exception to a lot of different things. Like as you can tell, you would never have anything else after a closing bracket except an else. So I think whatever's within an else, it's fine to just keep it at the same level because it's already somewhat indented, given that, you know, this return is all part of this like expression of this outer if versus this else. So it's like already kind of indented, using this outer if as the sort of like bellwether. So it's indented relative to this. And so the fact that, yeah, for else's, I think it's fine to have it on the same line. Good point though. Else's are a little funky. As you can tell, you probably want to avoid stuff like this if possible. So like you probably don't want to put an if inside of an if inside of an if. You probably do something like, you know, whatever logic that this encapsulates, you'd probably put this into its own function. So like you do something like, you know, if it is cold, go outside. And then inside go outside, there might be a bunch of ifs, like, you know, if in California, don't wear a jacket. Like there might be more ifs within this function, but at least it's encapsulated away in a separate function, so it makes sense to the reader, like, oh, if it's cold, then go outside. Versus like if, and then another if, and then another if, and then you're like, at that point, like you've lost your reader. So I would say anything more than like 2 levels deep, you should highly consider creating a function that just encapsulates whatever that if logic contains, those inner ifs, and then hide it away, hide the complexity inside a different function. Because no mortal mind can comprehend, I think, more than 2 layers in, you're getting into pretty dicey territory. All right, any other questions? Cool. So yeah, this is the format that the Q&As, I mean, the review is going to be like for the other problems. So, you know, you guys feel free to ask whatever question, like, oh, I'm confused by this. Why'd you do this? Why'd you do that? Like, feel free to just pester me with questions during this like review time, which will be before every lecture. Because there's going to be, you know, as we proceed, there's going to be challenging problems, and it's going to be really, you know, it's going to be really helpful to, you know, bounce your ideas off or ask your questions or just ask for as much help as possible. So yeah, feel free to Ask away. There's no other questions for now, then I'm gonna go ahead with the lecture for today.
Okay, I have a question.
Yeah.
Okay, right here, when at first that's what I did, but when I checked run the test, it failed. So I had to refactor it, and on the README it says like refactor it, like put like the variable something that a human can read. Like instead of like FSA, I put like num1, num2, num3, and instead of
better variable names. Okay. So yeah, I mean, in that case, I guess get max of, yeah, maybe something like num1, num2, num3.
Exactly, and what I did, I say like if num1 is superior to num2, and n%, like the double n%, and num1 is superior to num3. After that, I did else if
num1 is greater than num2 and num1 is greater than
num1 is
num3.
greater, yes, than num3. As after that, return num1.
Yeah. That sounds right.
Okay, and then I did else if.
Num2 is greater than num1 and num2 is greater than num3.
Yes, exactly. And num2 is greater than num3. And return num2. And
else
then else return num3.
And then this one broke?
Oh, yeah, I know.
Yeah.
That works.
Mm-hmm.
I think maybe there's some like spacing thing, or maybe there's there's been a small typo or something, but it works. That logic is perfectly sound. It's great logic.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, this is, I think, a lot cleaner than having nested ifs. So like this one handles the num1 case, this one handles, it's like very methodical. Like if you handle num1 first, you handle num2 second, and then you've already handled those two. So by default, the third one is the greatest. So it's great to be methodical, even though there's probably like some crazy one-line solution for this. I would say that this is a solid, clear approach to solving it. Great question. Any other questions?
Quick question about this. I see in some examples sometimes there isn't, and where I would want to put an else, the else is just left out and it just says return whatever, like here would be return num3. And is it necessary to include the else generally? Like, is it better to use it if you think you should?
So there are cases where you should, namely when there's no returns. But the return is like your safeguard. Essentially, because you're returning in each case, you don't really need an else. So that's a great point. You could just do something like this. It's a lot cleaner, in my opinion. Like, I try to avoid using else's if I can, but sometimes they're necessary. But let me see if this indentation looks weird to me. I don't know why, but yeah, there it is. So yeah, I would prefer something like this, where like, if this case, return num1. If you don't need an else, because if this were true, then it would have returned. So by default, it's acting as if there's an else here, but there really doesn't need to be. And I prefer this actually a lot better, just because else's, like, I don't like how it clutters things, and like it makes the indentations weird. I just like clean, just like, closing bracket and nothing after it. So yeah, you could do this, but let's say it wasn't a return. Let's say you were just like doing some operation here, like num plus one, num plus plus or something. I don't know why you'd want to do this, but then you need an else, because otherwise it's going to go here and then do this conditional. And then if this is also true, then it'll act upon it. So if you want one conditional to exclusively occur, that's when you'd use a return or an else. But if multiple things can occur, then you don't need the else, and you can just have an if here. So for example, let's say in a car wash, you wanted the car to get the normal wash and then the waxing and then the vacuuming, like those three things. If you only wanted one of those things, then you'd use an else. Like if the car got cleaned, then clean it. Else, if it didn't get cleaned, do the interior. But if you wanted all of them, then you would just put if like technically this number can get acted upon in this if too, because you didn't put an else. But if you put an else here, then like it can't be true for both of these.
We can't do both of them.
Yeah, it can't do both of them. But
okay.
if there's an if there's without a return, also the return stops from doing both of them, because if it does one of them, it's done. It'll break out of the entire function. So
okay.
Yeah, so it can get tricky, because if you start using a lot of ifs just because it's cleaner and it looks cleaner, and you don't want to use else's because it messes up the styling, or you just want to everything on the same indentation, use all ifs. But you might get some unintended behaviors because it's running both. If it's true for both these two things, then it's gonna go into both of these two blocks. And then if you're mutating and manipulating this num1 in both of them, for this case it wouldn't really matter. But let's say if let's say like if I'm trying to think of an example, like if wake up, if you then like brush teeth, right? Then you brush teeth. If morning, then I don't know, like shower. So in this case, if you wake up and then you brush teeth, and then it's also checking if the morning and you shower, so you could do both these things. But if there's an else, then
something else.
Yeah, if you didn't wake up, then it's the morning. I mean, no, this is a bad example, but like basically you can't do both of these things. You only do one of them.
Okay, so if you wake up, then you brush your teeth, and then it would just jump out, and then you wouldn't shower.
Yeah, exactly. Or if you had a return, right, then it would never even get here. Because if you woke up, then you just return brushing your teeth and you're out of the function, you're done. You brush your teeth and you're good to go. But, if there was no return, right, then you would say, oh, if I wake up, brush my teeth, and then I execute the next line. If it's morning, then I shower. So you could do both of these things without the return.
Okay, thank you. That's really helpful.
Yeah, it's something that I get caught up with too sometimes. If you just like plainly say, I'm gonna only use ifs, then you might run into these cases where you only want one thing to happen exclusively, but two things end up happening because both of those conditionals end up being true, and so you end up brushing your teeth and showering when you only intended to brush your teeth. Great question, though. Very good question. Any other questions?
So so for this example, what would the num3 be? That would just be like eat breakfast or something like that, or?
Yeah, so you could do something like eat breakfast, right? And so in this case, when it's the morning, you'd basically be doing all of these things. Let me see if there's a better example for this, because if wake up, if dirty, I guess, right? So you wake up and you brush your teeth, but you're also dirty. So you'll be forced to shower in this approach. you'll be forced to shower, and then no matter what, you're gonna end up eating breakfast. So you're gonna do all those three things if you've woken up and you're dirty. You're gonna end up doing those three things. Now let's put a return here. If you return, then if you wake up, you brush your teeth, and then someone just like kidnaps you out of the house, you can't do anything else. Like you're done. Like you've completed the function, and nothing after it can even run, because you're returning, which essentially is short-circuiting the function and outputting a value for that function, running nothing else that's subsequent to that. So you only brush your teeth. Also, if I did an else, so if you've woken up and you've brushed your teeth, you will never go into, you're not going to even check this, because you've done this and then you go straight to eating breakfast, because it's only if you haven't woken up that you'll check this condition.
And you do that, yeah.
But this is like logically impossible, because as soon as you wake up, you have woken up, so this function will be true, and then you'll brush your teeth. You'll never even get to executing this else, because this is true, and this will only run if this is not true. So in this else case, you're only going to brush your teeth and eat breakfast, but you're never going to shower, even if you are dirty, because you'll never even check the condition that you're dirty, because you'll just have woken up, and that'll be the first thing that you check, and then it'll skip this, and then it'll run this. So yeah, that's a gotcha usually. Got to be careful with that. Any other questions about this?
Seems good.
Yeah, this is really good questions. So if no further questions, then I'm gonna go to the lecture. We're gonna learn about loops and debugging today. Let's get started. So there's this concept of a loop, which is useful because sometimes you want the same thing to happen multiple. You want to run the same thing multiple times. For example, let's say you have a stack of dishes, right? Then you might, if you're programming a robot to do those dishes, you might say, for each dish, like put it into the water and then, do your thing, like for each dish though. So you're repeating this work for each dish. So you need this concept to be able to do repetitive tasks. And so we're going to get into the meat of loops and also debugging. I'm going to try to set up the debugger. The debugger in native to the browser is a little easier to use right out of the box. Basically, the debugger is helpful if you're stuck on something and you don't quite understand what's going on. The only thing about debugging using the actual debugger is that, for large programs, sometimes it takes a good amount of setup to configure, and also it can be quite expensive of an operation. Like your computer might start, making noises and like, I don't know. But so I think it's great to use. I personally have a bad habit of not using it as much and just using console logs. And I'll go through examples of how to use logs to debug too, because it's kind of like the same thing, but it's a lot more crude of a tool, because basically console logs is like trying to find a needle using a microscope versus trying to find the needle actually that's a bad example, but basically you're looking at a small slice of your program versus a debugger, which you can use to like see the value of a bunch of different things all at once. So it's a really high level overview, and usually you can like figure out what's wrong a lot faster. But it's kind of like the difference between using a more complex tool versus a really simple one. Sometimes you just go for the simple one because it's the lowest overhead. But I would say at this level, like I think console logs should be fine, honestly. But it's good to get, if you want to be an all-star, you should definitely look into using debugger tools. because at a certain point, console logs is just a very crude tool, like very crude. It's like, yeah, eventually you'd want to level up and use something a little more robust. So a while loop and a for loop, you can do pretty much the same things with them. It's basically, a very similar structure, but a while loop is a little more free because a for loop requires you to have those 3 elements, whereas a while loop, there's very little requirements. So sometimes with great responsibility comes danger, because you can accidentally forget something and then you end up in an endless loop. So while loops require 3 elements. There's the while keyword and a conditional expression that has to evaluate to a Boolean. So whatever you put into that parentheses will become a Boolean. So there's a lot of there can be some confusion into like what exactly is a Boolean, or a Boolean might be clear, but many things can become casted to a Boolean within a while loop. So if you have like while true, then it's always going to run this inside code because this is a Boolean itself. But you can also do like 3 is greater than 2. That evaluates to true. So it'll go in. You can also do something like while a string, like David, a string is true because it'll, even though it's not exactly true, meaning like it's not a Boolean value, it's a string value, it's called truthy. And we might go over this later, so I might be jumping ahead of myself, but basically there's a whole set of values that evaluate to true when put inside of a conditional. So it doesn't necessarily always have to just be like true or false, or like an expression like 3 equals 3. It doesn't always have to be like that. It can also be like a string or a number or something. But I mean, we don't want to get too crazy with this, but for now, whatever is inside the while loop has to evaluate to either true or false. And basically every data type will pretty much evaluate to either true or false, because it'll just force it to be either true or false, even though it's not explicitly true or false based on a specific set of rules. So yeah. Where am I? So yeah, we have while and then a conditional and then the block of code, and then inside that block of code it's gonna run that, and then when it's done running that, so let's say it's just one line of code, like line 7. When it's done, it's gonna go back and check the conditional again, and then if the conditional is still true, then it'll run that line 7 again, and then it's gonna go back to line 6 and it's gonna say, is this still true? Yes. Go to line 7, so on and so forth. So it's very important that within the block you do something that makes the conditional get one step closer to being false, because otherwise it's going to keep running forever. So we got to go over some examples. In this case, anyone want to take a stab at what this will log?
3, 2, 1.
Yeah, it'll log 3, 2, 1. Do you think it'll log something? Oh yeah, it'll log 3, 2, 1. You're right. I thought it was gonna log 0 too, but then I realized that it would only log 0 if count minus minus was in line 4. But since it's after the log, then it won't log 0. So I realize my face is hiding the answer, so I'm gonna just move this and see that does anything. Yeah, so great job. How about this one? Oh wait. I mean, I guess anyone want to take a stab?
Yeah, it will just it will log that string, right? It'll print that string. This line of code will never run.
It actually will not because, great guess though, but because it's false, it'll never go into that.
Oh.
Yeah, because it says while false, meaning like it'll never even execute that because it can only go into the block if it's true.
Oh, if it's true, okay, that's the rule of while. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I understand.
So then nothing will print?
Nope.
Nothing.
It'll just be this gray box that you see here. It'll never, the code will never even like, never run inside the block because the expression is false. And that's interchangeable. That's the same thing as doing something like while 2 is greater than 3. Because this is always false. It's never true. Like you will never reach this case where this is true, so this is a pretty useless line of code. So this is the dangerous case with using while loops. So while loops are nice and great because think about a for loop. Like you gotta do let I equal 0, semicolon, I is less than or equal to, you know, blah, blah, blah. You gotta think about all these things and you gotta do no semicolon, you gotta do I plus plus, I or I minus minus, and then you can finally get to what you wanna do. So it's like kind of annoying sometimes and you're just like, maybe I'll just use a while loop because it just is just a lot faster. But because it doesn't force you, the for loop is forcing you to increment or decrement closer to the base case or the case where the conditional is no longer true and the loop stops running. So it's forcing you to do that based on the syntax and the guardrails it has in place. But while loops don't do that, so it's a lot more free. But at the same time, you can forget to decrement or increment your variable because you're responsible for doing that within the body of the while loop. And so it's very easy to, while using a while loop, run into this line of code will run forever and basically it'll break the program. It'll crash the program unless your program has like allocated memory that is really large. So, yeah. So again, we have to make sure that the conditional is eventually false. And so, does anyone see a problem with this block of code?
The count isn't going down.
Yeah, exactly. It'll be 3 forever, and 3 is greater than or equal to 1 forever. Like that will never change as long as we're in this universe. And so it will run endlessly. And this like always happens. The annoying thing about this is like when you're programming and then you accidentally cause this to happen, like your whole computer will like slow down and like it's very annoying. Sometimes you gotta like it starts, the fan turns on and everything's like very laggy and sometimes it takes
How do you
a little
break out of that endless loop like that? Is there a...
I mean, your program will just crash.
Oh, okay.
And it'll just like, for example, like we can try it like on REPL. It'll just crash and then it'll just, you know, while 2 is greater than, or this, while 3 is greater than 2, console log memory bunch. It's pretty good. It's pretty, I mean, eventually it should crash. I don't know. It's pretty, I guess. Yeah, I don't know. I think I have made a grave mistake here. But yeah, it's like constantly printing it and then eventually it'll like break.
So usually with while loops, are you always either decrementing or incrementing?
Exactly.
Okay.
It's the same thing as a for loop, but the for loop just forces you to handle it, whereas the while loop doesn't. So it's a little more risky. But it's gonna happen. Guaranteed. Multiple times. All right, and yeah, the for loop is just it's training wheels. It's solid. It's not fancy, but you can't really, unless you really mess things up, it's probably gonna actually run to completion because of the guardrails. So you got your for keyword, and you've got your initialization of your variable, of your index. You've got your condition that while it's true, it's gonna constantly be running, and your final expression where you'll be forced to either increment or decrement closer to that condition being false, in which case it won't run the for loop anymore. So we have the initialization. It's only run once. And then after each iteration, the condition will constantly be checked with the new value of the initialized variable. And then it'll basically run the final expression after each iteration. So in this case, any guesses as to what this will print out to the console?
One, two, three.
Yep. It'll just be 1, 2, 3. You can loop in either direction. So this is really useful, let's say someone's like reverse a string, right? Reverse a string. Well, maybe I want to start, instead of at the beginning of the string, I want to start at the end of the string and then count down. And that way you can reverse the string. So, it's helpful. It's a helpful tool to think about whenever you're faced with some problem, like, how would you do this? Well, sometimes it's helpful to think, usually we think front to back, but what if we, started from the end and then went towards the beginning? Or what if we had one thing at the end and one thing at the beginning, and then we move them closer to each other? Like, there's different kind of possibilities that open up when you start thinking, not only in the traditional sense, but maybe in a more open-ended sense where why can't we try this or something. So reversing something is a great just mental model to have, or a little tool in your toolkit. What if we did it backwards, or what if we did it inside out, from the middle to the outside or something. There's different ways you can go about things, but yeah, this is a pretty standard reversal where instead of we start at the higher end and then we go until I is no longer greater than or equal to 1, and we decrement each time. So anybody want to shout out what this will print out?
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Perfect. So, we could increment by, we could get fancy with it, and, we want to count by hundreds, we can do that. 1, 2, 300. You can iterate through a string, so this is a really common thing that's done a lot. They might ask you, how many times does the letter A occur in this string? Or how many times, is there any repeats in this string? This is very common types of problems that would be helpful to practice, getting familiarized with this approach and this concept of iterating through a string. And so this is how you go about doing that, is basically you can access a property, you can access a character of a string via the index, and you have the index using the for loop because you have all those, you're going to iterate from 0 to 10, let's say. So you have the numbers 0 to 10, and using each of those indexes, you can access a specific character in the string, and so you can do whatever computation you'd like using that character. Anybody want to guess what this will output to the console?
A, B, C, D, E, F, G.
Exactly. A lot of people get confused. Do I do less than or equal to the length, or do I do less than the length, or do I do less than or equal to the length minus 1? That's a really common thing, and I honestly run into that still at times, and sometimes it's just trial and error. You just try it one way, and then if And then if you realize that you came up short, then you add 1, or if you used only less than and you came up short, then you use less than or equal to. But usually length minus 1 is like your last character. So I usually like to do like less than or equal to the length minus 1. But you could also do less than length. That's the same thing. Just tomato, just different preferences. But I like to just do less than or equal to length minus 1, because length minus 1 is the last character, because everything starts at 0.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we just pull out, like you said, if you just want to find like the vowels or something like that, how do you just pull those out?
Yeah, that's a great so do you want to create a new string with only the vowels, or do you want to count the vowels, or because you could go about it many different ways.
Mm-hmm.
Either way, just maybe just pull out all vowels or something like that.
Cool. Yeah. So you have your let's say you have your input or string with vowels. Naming is always tricky. Right? And this string has a bunch of vowels, like today is Thursday. I'm sure there's some vowels in there. And now you want to have string with only vowels or something, right? And then let's just initialize that as an empty string for now. Usually a good first step, if they want you to produce a new string or a new something, then just create a default value of like an empty array, or at least get the ball rolling there, where you sort of have this placeholder that you're going to add to in the function. And then you would do something like does anyone want to start?
This wouldn't be an array, right? Because it's a string. I mean, we're not putting the square brackets, or is that just Python? I'm thinking.
Oh no, it's JavaScript. But if you want to make an array, you can. But I'm just gonna create a string. I mean, I can make an array too. It's just, it wouldn't matter. But let's just keep the strings for now, just because we're learning. We'll learn about arrays later. So does anyone want to help me out? How far should I iterate till?
To string.
Length.
Mm-hmm.
String is vowels dot length.
I would say since I'm less than or equal to, I can do
minus 1.
Starting at the end, right? Or to the end.
Yeah. Increment. So now basically I have my indexes. So within here, I is going to be 1, it's going to be 2, or it's going to start at 0, it's going to be 1, it's going to be 2, it's going to be 3. So I have that. What does anyone want to take a stab at? What?
Do you have anything conditional with an if statement?
Yeah, perfect. So if, and then we need to do something here where we need to check its vowel. So
yeah.
First, I would say, how do we isolate the character? Like, how do we know what we're going to check? Because right now we only have numbers, right? How are we going to get the character?
You need to put all the vowels in there, A, E, I, O, U.
Oh, yeah, definitely do that. So let's just say...
Yeah.
Definitely need to do that. And then, how do I get the character, though? Because right now, I have 0, 1, 2, 3. I have that access to that within this for loop. But how would I get the specific character?
So you want string with vowels, bracket I?
Yeah. String with vowels, bracket I. So now we have the character check. So now we have T, O, D, A. So like we have all those individual guys. So now we can do something like, does anyone want to take a stab at this? Like, what should I put in this conditional? So
If string vowels I, bracket I, equal to vowels
do we have to set a counter for this one? For checking the number of them? Or are we just grabbing them
We're just
and not
grabbing
counting them?
We're just grabbing them and adding it to this. So there's many different ways you can do this. But I would say the simplest way is doing something like index of. So like vowels dot index of character to check does not equal to -1. So basically what this is saying, like, check where in here this character occurs, which index. If it's -1, then it's not a vowel because it doesn't occur anywhere in here. I mean, there's multiple ways you can do this. This is just the simplest way, but if you guys are not familiar with this, don't worry. It's not. We'll get into like what index of does. It's a pretty common method, string method, but I mean, you could use another for loop because basically the index of is another for loop that says, okay, the character to check, let's say it's T. Then it goes into here and it says, are you T? No. 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 Okay, you're not a vowel. So it's another for loop, but it's a lot cleaner when you could wrap that complexity up within a function. That's why functions are great. You should always use functions and not use another for loop. Well, like, you can't use a for loop inside of an if, but so in this case you sort of have to use a function, but yeah, if there's another case where you could have done that, you probably want to avoid nesting too deeply. I don't know why this thing is complaining because it's saying TypeScript, but I'm in JavaScript, so I don't know. This might not run, but
So is -1 saying it's the end of the string or to the end of the string or something else?
nope, it's just saying this does not contain whatever character I'm passing to it. So if I'm passing T, because character to check is either going to be T, O, D, because I'm iterating through this. So it's going to be like T, and then it's going to be O, and then it's going to be D with each iteration of the loop. So first it's going to be T. So it's checking is if T is in here. Basically it's checking if T is a vowel.
Yeah.
Because index of basically checks whatever the string is. So I'm doing vowels.index of, right? So it's going to check in this string at what index does this character occur.
And if it doesn't,
But
if it
it'll return -1 if it doesn't occur anywhere.
yeah.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah. Don't worry if this is like pretty, I mean, it's just an example of a for loop, but I wouldn't stress too much about index of or anything. Like we could just say this is like a black box that says like is vowel character to check. And I would argue that this is a lot cleaner to wrap that index of stuff in another function that's checks purely if something is a vowel, so that it's really clean like this. Like then you can read it like English. Like I'm iterating through strings with only vowels. I have this character to check, and I'm gonna put the character to check into the isVowels function, and that's gonna return me, is this a vowel? And then if it is a vowel, then what should I do? I need to add to this.
Add it to the empty string.
I can just add it like addition, and then that's pretty much it. And then after my loop runs, I can just console log string with vowels. I gotta replace this though, because unfortunately I could just make that function right now. Return vowels dot index of character is not equal to -1. I would say, this whole thing should be wrapped up in a function. So to be really clean, we should say function create string with only vowels, right? And then have that take in string with vowels as a parameter. And then all this stuff should be inside of that. Yeah, there's some like indentation stuff, but I'm not gonna worry about that too much right now because it kind of makes sense Nice. Like this. Yeah, it's weird. Sometimes I don't understand why. Okay, but regardless, we have this function, we have this function, and then we just say console log create string with only vowels, and then we pass it this input. And we probably want to put this within here. And here we need a return string with only vowels. It's a little cleaner. Now everything's like in a function, and it's not just lying. It's just not lying all over the place. It has everything has a home. And then if we just say today is Thursday, it should give us back all the vowels. It's not doing that. Let me see. Return. It's not even one. So perfect. This gets us into debugging. I don't get why this linter thing is complaining, but so it's not working, right? Like, let's just make sure that the console log at least is working. And this is something that's gonna happen to the best of the developers. Like, you know, no matter how good you are, you're gonna run into a question where, damn, like my answer, I should be expecting O, A, I, U. I should be accepting this string, but I'm not getting it. So what's going on here? Like, what's happening? First thing I would want to do is basically, let me just zoom this out. First thing I would want to do is basically, oh yeah, these should be indented. That's why it looks so weird. Okay, so first thing I want to do is I want to check, you know, is it ever going into here? Because, oh, I think I know what the bug is, but let's just keep it at this. So I'm gonna say, is it ever going in here? Because it should be going in here if it's a vowel. So I'm gonna log here, character, right? And then I'm gonna run it. Is it ever going in here? And it's not, because if it was going in here, we would be getting character, and then the character, that would be output to the console.
Ooh.
So this is like performing like going on a little hunt. Like, what's going on? What's wrong with my function? It's not getting in here. It should be getting in here. At least sometimes. You know, sometimes it shouldn't, because if it's not a vowel, it should never go into this if. But sometimes it should be getting in here. So why is it not getting in here? Well, if this doesn't work, then you got to go one level out and say, okay, so what is my character to check? Because like, I don't know, I'm like creating all these values, but I don't know what the values of these are actually. Because when the function runs, it's like a black box. So now I can check what the value of this is and then run it. Why isn't this right? Answer creates string with only vowels. I is less than or equal to. Okay, so it's not even getting into my for loop, right? So I can easily tell that this isn't even going into my for loop. So basically the bug is that I named this wrong. So this strings with only vowels, it should be string with vowels dot length. Because like that's the input of what I'm iterating through. Because this is an empty string, so it'll never even go into this for loop, because this condition will never be true. So yeah. Strings with vowels, different strings with only vowels, strings with. Nice. So now we have O A I U A. Because I had just misnamed this. I was supposed to iterate through the input. What I was iterating through was the initialized variable at an empty string, and you can't iterate through an empty string because there's nothing to iterate through.
Mm-hmm.
But console logs are really helpful because I could tell like something's weird, like it's not even getting into my for loop, like what the heck's going on, like, and then you realize that like your constraints are wrongly named and you won't ever enter the for loop, and thus you'll always return an empty string because you're declaring this empty string and then you're returning this empty string and you're not doing anything to it because you're never entering the for loop. So yeah, if this was all really simple, then it's great, but if it's not, don't worry about it.
So these 3 dashes and on the character to check and the answer, like, what is that? Is that a parameter of?
Yeah, it's just something to make me certain that this is what's logging. I don't need to do this. I could just do something like this. But then it's like a little less descriptive.
Yeah, it's pretty cool though to have them.
Yeah, because it's like a nice little marker to say like, oh yeah, this is my answer, and these are my characters that I'm checking. So it's like, if you don't do that, then it's like more ambiguous, like what you're actually checking in the console. So I like to, it's a little extra work, but I like to always put like, and usually the reason why I get into the habit of using these dashes is because like, when you're running a program, usually there's like a bunch of logs that like naturally come out. And so that's how you like kind of denote what you're logging versus like what's already logging in the program by default.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's sort of an example of for loops debugging. That's debugging right there for you. You just put some console logs. I think that's the introductory way to do it. There are other ways. So like, let's try, I mean, let's just go through the lecture first. Before that, is there any more questions on this? If not, then I'm just gonna continue on to the lecture and then we'll get into debugging, because debugging is cool because you don't have to do these things yourself. It kind of does them for you. Like it tells you what the intermediate values of all the variables are. But to be quite frank, I'm not even, I mean, I know I could do it, but I'm not 100% sure off the top of my head how to even do it for VS Code. I know for Chrome, like native in the Chrome, but when you're using the Chrome debugger, like you have to use it in this like interface. That's the debugger here. I know there's a debugger here somewhere, and it'll show you in this like tiny like thing, and it's not the greatest, but you can also use it in VS Code, the debugger, but it does require some configuration. So yeah, that's your for loop. You get your letter and you print them. Continue will cause the loop to skip to the next iteration. So anyone want to take a stab at what this will print to the console?
1, 2, 4, 5.
Yep. And the reason is because continue, it's not like a return where return will just stop the loop completely, or break. We'll learn about the word break, which is a short circuit in the truest sense. But continue is just like a soft short circuit where it won't run anything after it, but it'll still check the condition and still see if it needs to iterate once more. 1, 2, 4, 5. Because you say, oh, if it's I is 3, then don't do anything. Basically, it's like kind of like duck, duck, goose, where, you know, if it's a duck, then you continue. But if it's a goose, then you hit them in the head. So you can think of it like that. Alright, same thing with while loops. This one's a little weirder, but anyone want to take a stab at this?
So with this one, it's only going to print out the odd numbers. So I think.
Yeah, I think you're right.
5
Because
to 1.
if it's even, it'll just continue. So you're completely right. It should be 5, 3, 1, 0, 0 odd. I'm not sure, but yeah, only the odd numbers. And the reason is because if you guys are unfamiliar with the modulo sign, the parentheses or the percent thing, it basically says like if you divide it by that, is there a remainder? And like odd numbers, there's always a remainder if you divide it by 2, but even numbers, there's never a remainder. So it's basically just telling you what the remainder is if you divide it by that number. Break. It's hard circuit. Any guesses as to what this logs? Kind of a lot going on here.
You're adding 3 pluses to the A.
Yeah, exactly. And then it'll break. So this is a case where you're not decrementing the condition that it's checking, but you're adding a break statement if something happens. So, and you're getting your value closer and closer to that point where the break is true. So in this case, you don't really need to increment or decrement. Or 2 pluses, not 3, but because, yeah, it'll break before the third one is added. It also works in for loops. Oh, I accidentally went too far. But when it gets to a certain condition, it'll stop the loop. So it's a short circuit approach. Return would work as well if it was within a function. You can't just return if it's like not within a function. So, but the thing about return is if you use a return, it would stop executing the entire function, whatever comes after it. So let's say like 5 for loops in a function, then if you use a return, it would break out and it would never hit the other for loops. But if you use the break, it would only break out of that for loop, and it would still run the code under it. So that's one distinction. All right, debugging. So coding is hard, and there's always going to be bugs. Or, yeah, it's just never going to work right the first time. But a good, a positive mentality and some console logs just goes a long way in order to finding what these bugs are. But let's try a debugger, because let's see how that works out in Chrome. So we have this get max function. This might be a good example. Let me see. I don't use it that much, but I think it's simple. Console. Network, what the heck? Sources tab. Alright, sources. I mean, there has to be a way to just debug regular. Oh yeah, it's right here. Yeah, it's gonna get a little confusing. Just try to see if I can. I mean, let me try to do this on VS Code, because I don't know if this is even gonna be helpful in this like kind of environment. But I mean, I could try it actually. I don't have to try. Return num1, return 2. I need to set a breakpoint though. How do I do that? Let me see the lecture. Well, I guess first thing to note that we want to go over is, when the tests fail, it usually tries to give you an error message, and so it's usually good to take a look at that and say, sum is not defined. So maybe you're declaring sum outside of the scope of something and you don't have access to it within a scope and you're trying to use it, or let's say, you misspelled it and it's actually sum of numbers, but you just refer to it as sum. So you've never declared sum of sum, so it's not defined. So yeah, it's always very helpful when specs fail, look at the error message. It's also stack trace, so it usually tells you what line, and it's a pretty good estimate of where the error is, and this is always really helpful, but you can't always trust it because programs are really complex and it's not always easy to figure out, where exactly your bug is, because one function could call a different function and that could call a different function. There's all this tangled web of complexity, and so sometimes it's only a guess as to where it could be. Google is your best friend. Sometimes, you may get this weird error message and you might as well try Googling it, because the beauty of JavaScript is that a lot of people use it and there's a huge online community around it. And so usually whatever thing you've encountered, someone else has also encountered that. So it's really helpful to always try Googling it as well. This is usually a good sign. So if you get like expected 55 but equals 25, that's usually a good sign that like there's nothing crazy that's like breaking your function, but you just have some type of logic where you just messed it up. Like maybe you just didn't add, you subtracted, or maybe you forgot to put an else and you just have if and it's going into both of them. Therefore it's you're going to both of them, so therefore it's decrementing by, or it's incrementing by too much or something. So this is usually a good sign. Yeah, these are pretty intuitive. You expected something, you get something else. If it's failing with undefined, then usually a good thing to note is that your function may not be returning anything. So for example, like let's go over an example of that. So let's say I forgot to return, just forgot the statement in this function that creates strings with only vowels. Then if I did something like, okay, so I'm going to declare a new variable, like my string with only vowels equals create string with only vowels, and then I'm going to say let there be light. So does anyone want to guess what value this will be? Like, what will this be?
E-I?
Good guess, but I took away the return. So previously this had a return. Strings with only vowels, but I took that away. Basically,
you would get an error.
It wouldn't be an error though. It would be undefined.
Oh, undefined.
Yeah, output is undefined, because if you call a function without a return variable, it's not giving you back anything. So it's undefined. Like whatever you're trying to set this, you're creating this, you're initializing this variable with the output of the invocation of this function, but the function invocation doesn't return you any value. So invoking that function,
okay.
Yeah, it just doesn't do anything. Well, it does. Well, it actually did run all this code. Like all this code did run, but without the return, whatever is the caller doesn't have access to anything that the function just did. It's like a side effect. It's basically like saying, hey, look, bake those cookies, but don't give it to me. Like, don't give me the cookie, just bake it. So it bakes, you call this function, so it's starting to get you know, the gears are rolling and it's actually computing all this, and it actually creates this variable, but you've never returned out of it, so you've never outputted anything from it. So all you've done is work, but you kind of have nothing to show for it, if that makes sense, because it's a side effect. You've essentially created a side effect where you told the baker to bake you cookies, and the baker worked very hard, baked it for you, but you never asked for the cookie. You just said bake it.
So what line would you put the return on then?
Right here. Because that's when the for loop ends. And that's when I know I've done all my work that I want to for this particular case.
So now will it print out
Yeah.
EEI?
Yeah. So that's kind of like what this was saying with the, if you're getting undefined to equal, expected undefined to equal, that probably means like you forgot to return, or you just set a value and like you didn't do anything to it. Like you just set like, oh, let string only vowels, you just declared it, but you didn't do anything. Like let's say you just didn't do anything here. That's the same thing, then it's still gonna be undefined. This thing's like really laggy. Because you've declared it, but you like somehow didn't go in the for loop or something, and like you never added to it, and then now you're just returning something that you've declared. This variable is undefined. You haven't defined it. You've declared it, but you haven't defined it. It has no identity. It doesn't even know what it is. Like, is it a string? Is it an array? It's nothing. It's just an amorphous blob, and so because of that, it will be undefined as well.
David, what's the difference between when const is used versus function or something else?
Const, you mean?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So basically, you could do something like const create string with only vowels equals
An arrow function.
The arrow function. You could do that. It's just shorthand. I mean, there are actual implications of doing this in like classes, for example, like when you use a regular function versus using an arrow function, there's stuff that happens, and like it is different, but you can use it for the same purposes as well. Or you could even just do something like this: const equals function without the arrow function. Like you could set, you know, a variable to be a function, but there are some minor differences. Like for example, like when you use function, what happens, man? I don't want to get too in depth into this, but when you use function, there's something called hoisting that happens, which basically means like it doesn't matter what order you declare it in, which is kind of nice, because you can declare it in any order, and even if you declare this in below something, you can still call it, even though it's not in the right order, because you used function. Right, but if you use the declaration, like if you use const, then you can't, because it happens in the order that you declare it. But function, if you use the function keyword, it gets hoisted, so like the whole file has access to it, regardless of whether it comes after or before. That's like one difference. That's simple, but there's a bunch of there's other differences. Like that gets into like how the engine of the language works to like, you know, parse these tokens into the like the scope and create the context and the environment. And it's the brain. It'll get into the brain of the language, but I don't want to get into that right now. I also don't know too much about it, to be honest, because you don't have to. That's the beauty of abstractions, is that all that is handled for you. But yeah, I mean, for the time being, we can just understand that when you use function, you can use this wherever in the file. It doesn't have to be like you have to declare it first and then you use it. But if you use declarations like const variable equals arrow function or regular function, then you have to respect the order it was declared, or else it'll be undefined. Great questions, though. Great questions. what was I at? Okay, so yeah, these are just some common bugs, like you forgot to return and therefore you're not getting back any value. And usually when you're not getting back a value, it's not defined because you haven't defined anything. Can also help to directly look at the code. So when you're working through these workshops, you should look at the tests. Like here, it should have the tests, right? So yeah, just like read these out and see what exactly it wants you to do. Because although there is a README, sometimes, these are the tests that it's expecting to pass. And it helps to read out like, oh, okay, so my function just in camel case, it should take this, and it's saying the type of whatever it returns should be a string. So I'm going to try to make this function so that whatever it returns, it'll have a type that's equal to string. And so it's helpful to read through the test cases. So yeah, as a debugger. So I tried fiddling with this before class, and it was confusing me. Let me try again. Where's my VS Code? So I have this debugger. If you guys are familiar with this is it's kind of overkill, honestly, unless you're actually creating applications, to be writing your code in this kind of environment. For now, I would say, if you guys have free time, definitely feel free to download VS Code, play around with it. It's pretty much the de facto IDE, aka the editor used for like JavaScript and web development. I mean, you could do other languages too. It supports a lot of different languages, but it's pretty widely accepted among the web developer community. Every backend people may probably use a different IDE. There's different ones out there that are specialized for different things, but this one is good for web development, I would say. And yeah, basically the whole idea is like you have this function, right? And then you call it, maybe I didn't call the function, loop, and then you give it, so you call the function, and let's say you want to see like, you put a breakpoint here, meaning you want it to stop at this point at each iteration, and then it'll give you a snapshot into like all the intermediate values of all the variables. So let me try this. Yeah, I'm not sure what's like even happening, to be honest. Like, if you try to do this in a big file that has a lot of stuff, it usually takes a long time too, which is why I also... Oh, there it is. Cool. So I did some fiddling around, and as you can see, there's the cool thing about this is like, there's no console logs. You don't have to put console logs. And so we say, okay, this is how the function is running. And at each instance, these are the variables, right? So num loops is 0 and times is 5 because I passed 5 in. And then we see how this evolves. So now I became 0. And then num loops becomes 1. And then I becomes 1. Do you guys see this, by the way? Like this side thing? Yeah. So you can imagine how much more useful this is, because it's literally showing how your program is executing, like what's happening step by step as you like step through the function, and then it tells you what all the variables are too on the side, so you don't have to console log them. I should probably look into becoming more adept at using the debugger, but sometimes I just use console logs because it's the easiest thing to reach for. But this is a little more, this example is it's a little silly to use the debugger, but let's say you had a function that had like a lot of variables, right? Then you kind of want to see what's happening. This is a very perfect tool. But once your program starts getting like really complicated, then it becomes I think at that point logs start becoming useful again, more useful, because there's simply too much stuff going on to really try to debug through it. So I think it's kind of like a what's it called? A hyperbole, or it basically like is very useful for like this like sweet spot of complexity, and then once it gets too complex or too simple, then it's just overkill. But yeah, you guys feel free to download VS Code and play around with it if you guys want. And if you guys run into any issues with the debugger, I can help out. But you don't have to use it. You can just use console logs you can use console logs effectively, especially when you're starting out. What else is there? I know this lecture's running a little long, but we're almost at the end, I believe. So you guys can take a little break after this. And yeah, you can do that in Chrome too. Inspect console, run your code in Chrome. Oh, let me try that code pen then. So, let's see, debugger. I run this. There's too much going on. There's a run button on this thing. Okay, there it is. Nice. So yeah, you just need to add debugger and then run the code in CodePen, and then it does this for you out of the box, which is cool. Same concept. But now all the values are, where's all the values at? Oh, it's right here. Num equals 130, num2 equals 20, num3 equals 10. And then, yeah. And then it's gonna get into all this weird stuff, but you can give it a go. Play around with it. Let's get out of this thing. Okay. Alright. We did VS Code. That's it. So I'm gonna stop recording.